Morning. I'm obviously not Aaron again. I'm going to be covering his notes for him today. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 5. Um, Basically, it's going to be kind of the same as last time. He gave the notes, he wrote the notes, and he's going to make sure those are available for those of you who like to receive those, I think through email. He emails those out. I have those notes that he intends to email, so he's still writing the class material. I'll just be presenting that for you this morning. We'll be in Daniel 5. So starting out, we're going to kind of cover, I don't know if you want to call it an introduction to this chapter, but it bears a little importance to give some information about the timeline and the history as we get started. He says that we need to remember that chapter 4 was during what was likely the final years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, but Babylon, of course, did not fall until 539, so we're jumping 23 years into the future. That's important to note because chapter 5 chronicles the fall of the empire, while Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, was king. This was after chapters 7 and 8, and they occurred earlier in Belshazzar's reign. We know this, of course, because the chapters 7 and 8 open with saying in the first year of Belshazzar, and in the third year of Belshazzar, respectively, chapter 7 and chapter 8. And bring me that lapel up here. It's going in and out. We're having some interference this morning. It says, so we ask the question, why do these seem to be out of order? Well, it's possible that these were out of order to keep the Aramaic sections together. Chapters 2, 4 through 7 and verse 28 are mostly Aramaic. Possible that the similarities in chapter 4 and 5 are why these chapters are together and 7 and 8 are divided up and come after these events, or rather before these events. Here it comes with my mic. We'll fix that up. We'll have to be aware of that, I guess, as we get going in worship. All right, how's that? I'll go ahead and mute this one so we don't have any issues. Sorry about that. Again, these are probably written in this order, or possibly they're grouped in this order, the way that the Bible as we have it now is laid out, simply because, well, maybe it's because they wanted to keep the Aramaic sections together, and maybe it's because chapters 4 and 5 have a lot of similarities, such as arrogant, proud kings defying Yahweh, the vision that they needed to interpret, Daniel interpreted, possibly God's judgment coming on them. So to keep in order, though, with the order that we have today, the order that we find in our English Bibles, we'll continue with chapter 5 and what we're going to cover. So the history at the time of chapter 5 and the time of Babylon's fall. This was, starting out, it mentions a feast. This was not a feast during a time of peace, but the Medo-Persian armies were actually coming after Babylon, right? So the armies were surrounding. They were the armies of Cyrus, the Persian, had Babylon surrounded, and they were trying to wait them out. The Medes had been Nebuchadnezzar's allies during his reign, as his wife was a Mede named Amytis. Well, Babylon had enough food stored up in the city for years, according to historians, and of course they had a water supply of the Euphrates, which ran right there between the city and around the city. So that wasn't an issue. That wouldn't have caused them any problems. It provided a moat, it gave them some extra protection, and of course they had plenty to drink. Well, at the end of the chapter, we'll see the fall of Babylon. So who was Belshazzar? Well, the name Bel, protect the king. So Belshazzar was the son and co-regent or co-ruler. So he ruled alongside with his father, Nabonidus. Nabonidus was, until the end of the 19th century, he was unknown to historians except for Daniel, Baruch, and Josephus' writings. Nabonidus was known to be the last king of Babylon, and some said that Belshazzar was a made-up king, and Daniel was wrong. So, many people, of course, have made statements like that throughout history. Well, there's no such thing as, what was it we may have mentioned last week? The Ebla tablets mentioned the 5 cities, and that I think Abraham went up, and it's talked about some in Genesis. A lot of people for years said that wasn't a thing, that those cities never existed, and then we find tablets, and it says, oh, they did. Same is true of David. Many people denied that David ever existed as a king until later we found archaeological evidence, and it says, of course, well, there was a David. We don't have an issue with that as those who believe in the Bible and trust God, believe in the inspiration of the Scriptures, but many people have tried to use those kind of things to accuse the Bible of being inaccurate. This is a kind of similar issue with that. So they believed that Belshazzar was made up and that the book of Daniel was wrong. They tried to use that as a way to say it's invalid, you shouldn't trust it. Well, in 1854, a British explorer uncovered a cylinder that contained a prayer for the long life and good health of Nabonidus and for his eldest son, Belshazzar. That's from Allen Millard, Daniel, and Belshazzar in History. Other historical evidence shows that while Nebuchadnezzar served Marduk, Nabonidus, Nabonidus' mother, was a priestess for the moon goddess Sin. And this made Nabonidus unpopular with the Babylonian priest. So he left the Timon, which is, I think, the temple, to restore a temple to Sin there, and he entrusted the kingship to his oldest son. That's what we're talking about here, Belshazzar, his firstborn. Since the evidence from about 37 texts from that time of Nabonidus has shown that he resided at Timnah in Arabia, which is about 500 miles south of Babylon, for most of his 17-year reign, and it was apparently for religious reasons. So during these long absences, it was Belshazzar, the crown prince, who ruled the empire. And that has some significance when you look at what offer he made to Daniel was what it was. He said, I'm going to make you third in the kingdom. That's because he was second. He couldn't make him second, of course, being that's the position he held. This is why Daniel 5, 16, and 17, of course, mentioned that. So him being the third. While Belshazzar is called the son of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel 5:22, and also in Daniel chapter 5, verses 2, 11, 13, and 18, his father, we need to remember that this is how people back then spoke of relatives. They would say they were the son of this or that, and they might point to an individual that was well-known or more well-known or respected, and they're from that line. Some have wondered if he married a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Possibly he's referred as that because he did so there as well. Both are possible. So, chapter 5, verse 1, go ahead and get started into the actual text. And it says, Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. So, we mentioned earlier, well, what kind of feast is this or what's going on? Well, I mean, it's a feast for 1,000 people. Large feasts of this kind were not uncommon during ancient times. And a commentator mentions that the great feast was given by Oriental potentates, and they were notorious for their extravagance. Well, that's true. Montgomery cites sources relating to the one Persian king fed 15,000 persons daily, and that Alexander entertained 10,000 guests at a marriage festival. According to Esther, chapter 1, 1 through 4, Xerxes held a gathering for a large number of people that lasted 180 days. So Porteus remarks, the picture given here of the feasting customs of the Babylonian court need not be questioned. The evidence we have refers mainly to Persian times, but it is not unlikely that Babylonian practices were similar. Concerning the historicity of this feast, both the Greek historians Herodotus and Xenophon testified that a banquet was in progress on the night Babylon fell. And the date would have been proposed October 12th, 539 BC, or about 30 years after the events of chapter 4. Well, This information can be found in a book written by Miller, Stephen Daniel, Volume 18. It comes from the Nashville, Broadman, and Holman publishers. Good information, good to think about some of that. The fact is, it makes sense that he would be holding a feast at the time. It fits with the customs of that time. So while he tasted the wine, it says in verse 2, Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. So they tasted wine. That appears to have a force in the original language, or feeling the effects of the alcohol. So like saying he was drunk. He was beginning to become drunk. So while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders. And is literally Belshazzar commanded while at the time of tasting the wine. So it seems to carry with it the idea of not only sensing the flavor of the wine, but feeling its effects. And in other words, he's going to make this what becomes a foolish order while he's drunk. Verse 3 rather. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 13, chapter 25, verse 15, and Daniel 1, 2, as well as Ezra chapter 1, 7 through 11, give accounts of when they were taken, and also when they were returned after the captivity. That is, when the vessels were taken. Again, if you want all of these references, I know he's willing to email these out, and he's doing so on a list right now. It says in verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. So what was the purpose of this banquet? Well, outside of the city walls camped the Persian armies, according to the Nabonidus Chronicle. The Babylonians had suffered a crushing defeat just days before at the hands of the Persians, and Nabonidus had fled. Only the great city Babylon remained unconquered, and the situation appeared bleak. So you have to ask that question. That's a good question. Why were they having a feast? If everything's falling apart around them and the country's being destroyed and the last thing standing is the main city, why have a feast? Well, some people believe they were eating and drinking for tomorrow they die, quote unquote. Might as well, I suppose. There's nothing left to do, so they'll go down with the ship and might as well have a party while they're doing it. That's one idea. Some believe they were having a feast to their false god to save them. A lot of the feast and worship at the time would involve, or a lot of the worship at the time of pagans could involve things like this, feast and festivals. So possibly they were trying to appease their god. Some believe they were just trying to mock the Persians surrounding their city about how impenetrable the city was. Herodotus in Histories 1 speaks of how they had enough food in the city to last years. Herodotus and Xenophon both seem to support this was the time of a yearly festival. That's another possibility, and that goes with the idea of it being a feast. Persians may have taken advantage of that opportunity, or maybe it's a combination of some of those things together. Perhaps they are trying to appease some pagan deity. Perhaps they are also doing it as a way of saying there's no need to worry, to encourage themselves in the sense, and also to present the fact that there's nothing for them to be afraid of from the people outside the wall. Daniel chapter 5, verse 5. In the same hour, the fingers of a man. This is where things start to become, of course, the thrust of the chapter. The same hour, the fingers of a man appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. So this plaster has been confirmed that they believe by archaeological digs in the area. Coldway, who led a number of excavations at Babylon beginning in March 1899, commented that the walls of the throne room were washed over with white gypsum. In other words, it makes some sense about the material that you could imagine it be. This commentary in notes on 5.5 actually explains why they believe they've found the throne room, and describes the color and images on the bricks and the ruins. And Miller, Stephen Daniel is that commentary. We've mentioned that again earlier, but that's the one that he's referencing a lot. Verse 6, then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and knees knocked against each other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. Let me take a sip. Not Belshazzar's wives, talking about the queen that comes in. As Daniel 5, 1 through 2 mentions, his wives were already there. So some believe this queen to be Nebuchadnezzar's wife. Most likely, this was Nabonidus' wife, or a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, named Nitocris. Herodotus and Josephus identify her as Nitocris, and I might be butchering that, so you'll have to forgive me on the pronunciations, right? But it's Nitocris, Nitocris, I don't know. Somebody has a better idea. There's a lot of gentlemen here that have studied this just as much. Verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father, the king, brought from Judah? So Daniel would be an old man by this time. We're talking about, what we say earlier, 563 BC. He would have been led away in the captivity, and this is quite a while after that. That would have started first when? Was it 612, the first leading away, I think is right. So this is some years later. This is some time. He had served Nebuchadnezzar his entire reign, which would have been about 43 years. And at 17 at the time of captivity, serving 43 years, he would have been around 60 when Nebuchadnezzar died. And then you add another little bit of time, so possibly 78 when you add about 18 years of other kings ruling between the time that Nebuchadnezzar died and the time of Nabonidus, when the city would have been laid siege. So Daniel has already had visions in chapter 7 and 8 of Medo-Persia conquering Babylon. And again, that's some of the importance about why explaining, the significance of why 7 and 8 are actually before chapter 5. He's already prophesied this happening in a sense. He's already talked about, even in the vision of the statue that we've talked about before. I think, was it chapter 3 maybe? 2 and 3. The head of gold being Babylon, those below it, well, that next part, that silver, that's what's happening now. This is the beginning of that. So Daniel likely already knows of what's going on here. Isaiah 13:17, Isaiah 45:1, and 47:1 through 11 have some bearing on this. Let's stop there and pause for a second and ask, does anybody have any questions or comments so far? Maybe they got something you can add. We got a lot of preachers and men of experience here. Maybe you can add something in if you want. I say men. Ladies might know something too. I don't mean to exclude them, and not at all. But anybody have any comments or questions? All right, we'll keep moving on. Verse 14, I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Verse 15, now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me this interpretation. But they could not give the interpretation of this thing. And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Montgomery cites ancient sources, such as Xenophon and Herodotus, indicating that purple, of course, was the color of royalty. And most people are familiar with that idea, but during the Persian time, the Persian period, the gold chain mentioned could be worn only by persons of rank, and it was especially given by the king as a special compliment. It could only be worn if one was presented it by the king. Verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom, majesty, and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up, and whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, and he was deposed from his kingly throne, they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. So, of course, the evidence exists that indicates that Belshazzar may have seen these events firsthand and served as chief officer during the administration of King Nerigalaiser, I'm not sure how you say that one either, in 560, according to Babylonian historical texts. So this means that the king was old enough to fill a high position in the government only 2 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562. So since Nabonidus was an official in Nebuchadnezzar's administration, Belshazzar would have lived in Babylon and would have observed personally the last years of the great king's reign. Thus, Daniel's rebuke is even more understandable. He knew all these things to be true. Belshazzar had seen with his own eyes that what had happened to the king, and yet had refused to humble himself before the Most High God. And if you remember some other times of your study or reading through, that's talking about the period when the king essentially was driven out like he was a madman and lived in the field with the animals. And he did so until he made the admission that he was not as high as he thought he was, and that God was the ruler and true controller over the nations, including himself. So Belshazzar would have known this and seen this. He would have seen what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He would have been aware of that time period. Yet nevertheless, you see him operating in such a prideful way, and surely he would have had knowledge of who was the God of Daniel and the other Jews that had been taken, that Nebuchadnezzar had this experience with. So he would have this knowledge and awareness of what went on with Nebuchadnezzar, who or what God, according to the way he would have viewed things, had done this to him, but nevertheless he refused to humble himself. And then he called for the vessels from the temple. It's kind of amazing to think that a man could be aware of God's power in such a potent and real way. You know, we read of it and we have faith and we understand the Bible to be true. That's quite, I don't know, to me it's quite extraordinary that a man can look at God demonstrating his power directly as well, and still, having heard some prophecy, having heard the Jews speak of things and then see what happened, still refuse to humble himself. Of course, we see that over in the New Testament as well, when the Pharisees and Sadducees and other factions of the Jews had seen and heard what Jesus had done, yet still refused to humble themselves. So it's not a shock or surprise truly, I suppose, but it's amazing to think that he would have known this and still refused to do so. Verse 23, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you. You and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. I think this really kind of leans me towards that conclusion that they're trying to appease some pantheon of gods, someone that they think is going to save them and help them. They've obviously brought these vessels in, and they're going to use them. Why he did it, I don't know. I don't know exactly. I mean, I don't think that the text gives any indication that he was doing it to spite Jehovah, that he was doing it to spite the Jews. Perhaps he thought that these things taken from some temple were somehow mystically imbued with power, and him using them in this worship to these idols was going to make it better. I'm not sure. But oh, no.
And in their mind, I still think that he just one among all of us.
Absolutely.
Yes, this God is maybe a little bit more powerful than something, but he's still just one of the gods that, is able to do whatever. And they're really not giving him the credit for who he really is. So I guess maybe that's one of the reasons why they really don't seem to grasp it, because they don't really recognize God as who he really is.
No, I agree. And what she said, I think, is absolutely true. They obviously aren't thinking of Jehovah as the one true God. Perhaps they believed that he was a God. He was the God of the Jews, or the God of the region from where the Jews came. A lot of times, the people of that era would think that gods had certain jurisdictions, I don't know what else you want to call it, areas that they kind of were the gods of. You had a god of the hills and maybe a god of the plains, for example. So perhaps they were thinking of him in this way. And to me, that leads to what I was saying and thinking before as well. I don't think that they were really considering anything about Jehovah when they called for the vessels. At least I don't see any reason to think that he was doing it particularly with Jehovah in mind. It was just, maybe he was thinking of Jehovah will bless me if I use his vessels to worship these other gods, like I'm including him somehow. Perhaps that was it. But of course they were wrong. We see Daniel saying here that you've lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. So he did that because they had brought the vessels. That's why he said it. You brought these vessels in, and that was Belshazzar lifting himself up against the Lord of heaven. That's one way in which he did it. He was presumptuous in what he thought he was allowed to do. Well, they didn't glorify him. So Nebuchadnezzar was a mighty and powerful king, and nations feared him, and of course he was legendary. God humbled him. So therefore, the question is, who are you, this third down or second down or whatever from him since he reigned? I guess he would be even the co-regent to Nabonidus. Who are you, right? You think you're going to do these things. You're going to participate in worshiping these idols with these instruments meant and dedicated for Jehovah. And you know what happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he did that. So who are you? Why do you think you can get away with doing this, I suppose is the question. So why would he want to defy Yahweh? The fingers of the hand in verse 24. It says, then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written. I may not say it right, but many tekel upharsin. Tekel, I think, has been suggested as an alternate for shekel. So that's why I say it that way. But they're all measures of weights or terms used. Many or mena is a measure of weight, as in 1 Kings 10:17 and Nehemiah chapter 7, verse 71 through 72. Tekel. Again, possibly an alternate spelling for shekel, and upharsin, a word which means divided. So the message was, if we put it in English, numbered, weighed, divided. they likely would have had someone around who might have known what the words were, but definitely not what they meant. So even if they were able to look at the wall and someone to say, well, the words mean numbered, weighed, divided, that would have, what does that mean? What's the significance of that? Like, to see that written on a wall, even if whether you know what it says or don't know what it says, even if you know, you're still going to say, okay, numbered, weighed, divided, what's the point? So Daniel would interpret. Verse 26, it says, this is the interpretation of each word, meaning, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, or I hope I'm saying that right, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple. They put a chain of gold around his neck, and they made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. So that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain by Cyrus and his army. One night, Daniel was, I guess, most similar in my mind to the position Joseph would have held in Egypt, something like that. He wasn't the king, just as Joseph wasn't Pharaoh, but he was the only person that was nearly as powerful as the person holding the throne, I guess you could say. He was third in the kingdom. Of course, Nabonidus being the number one, Belshazzar being two, the co-regent, he was just below them. In Aramaic, verse 531 is grouped with Daniel 6:1. Aaron here has a note about that. He says it's showing the same Darius in view. The same Darius or Darius, however you prefer to say that. It's the same Darius of Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 28. So there's no need to see different ones. Some people may. He is 62 years old when he takes the kingdom, Daniel 5:31. He is the son of Ahasuerus, Daniel chapter 9 and verse 1. And racially, he was a Mede, Daniel 5:31, 9:1, and 11:1 point to that. So we're transitioning who we're talking about here. We're talking about Darius or Darius. And is placed over the Chaldean realm in Daniel 9, verse 1. Verse 31, of course, says, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So how did this happen? What way did they conquer the city, I suppose? Well, 3 times it refers to rivers and waters being dried up in passages. It discusses judgment on Babylon. We can read a few of those passages. Someone want to get Isaiah 44, verse 27? Someone else read for us Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 38, and Jeremiah 51, 36. Again, those are Isaiah 44, 27, Jeremiah 50, 38, and Jeremiah 51, 36. Yes, 44:27.
That said to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up the river.
All right, 50:38, Jeremiah 50.
Upon her waters, and they shall be dried up, for it is the land of graven images, and thou art mad upon their idols.
Okay, and 51:36.
Therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, I will plead your case and take vengeance for you. I will dry up her sea and make her springs dry.
Right. I guess I should have said, I didn't look, I used just the reference here. It might have been good for 35, but 35 says, the violence done to me and my flesh be upon Babylon. So we're talking about Babylon here. So history records how it happened. Herodotus in Histories 190, which was a 5th century Greek historian, 5th century BC, so 500 years before Christ, just very short period after these events. He wrote, having, however, thus wreaked his vengeance on the, another word I'm going to struggle with, but Gyndes, Gyndes, by dispersing it through 360 channels, Cyrus, with the first approach of the ensuing spring, marched forward against Babylon. The Babylonians, encamped without their walls, awaited his coming. A battle was fought at a short distance from the city, in which the Babylonians were defeated by the Persian king. Whereupon they withdrew within their defenses. Here, this is the Babylonians, here they shut themselves up and made light of his siege, having laid in a store of provisions for many years in preparations against this attack. For when they saw Cyrus conquering nation after nation, they were convinced that he would never stop and that their turn would come at last. Cyrus was now reduced to great perplexity. As time went on and he made no progress against the palace, in this distress, either someone made the suggestion to him, or he bethought himself of a plan, which he proceeded to put in execution. He placed a portion of his army at the point where the river enters the city, and another body at the back of the place where it issues forth. Again, if you imagine Babylon, it's a city with a river running straight through it. They would have had some defenses where the river enters and where it exits, but it would have still been allowed to flow through the city. So he's going to place a portion of his army at both parts. He gave them orders to march into the town by the bed of the stream as soon as the water became shallow enough. He then himself drew off with the unwarlike portion of his host and made for the place where Nitocris dug the basin for the river, where he did exactly what she had done formerly. He turned the Euphrates by a canal into a basin, which was then a marsh, and on which a river sank to such an extent that the natural bed of the stream became fordable. Hereupon, the Persians who had been left for the purpose at Babylon by the riverside entered the stream, which had now sunk so as to reach about midway up a man's thigh, and thus they got into the town. Had the Babylonians been apprised of what Cyrus was about to do, or had they noticed their danger, they would have never allowed the Persians to enter the city, but they would have destroyed them utterly, for they would have made fast all the street gates which gave access to the river, and mounting upon the walls along both sides of the stream, would have so caught the enemy, as it were, in a trap. But as it was, the Persians came upon them by surprise, and so took the city. Owing to the vast size of the place, the inhabitants of the central parts, as residents at Babylon declare, long after the outer portions of the town were taken, knew nothing of what had chanced. But as they were engaged in a festival, continued dancing and reveling until they learnt about the capture. Such then were the circumstances of the first taking of Babylon. And he has here, you can read the full account on livius.org, and he gives a full link that'll be available in the notes. So basically, again, another historian, Herodotus, there in the 1st century, he says this was a time of a festival. So it very well could have been all of those things we mentioned earlier. Perhaps they were taking these vessels, they were going to drink from them because it was a festival, but it was a festival to what? A religious festival, so they're trying to appease these gods and they're trying to ask for help. And those are the reasons that they would have been doing so. Questions or comments about this particular chapter? We're coming up a little early on to today's class, but
in all of this chapter here, I can't think of once again how it really shines forth the faithfulness, the boldness of Daniel's. I mean, we need to think about who he's speaking to when he says, you've not humbled yourself.
yeah.
You've not glorified God. This is what you've done. You've defiled the vessels. And he doesn't mince words. He's very direct. He had done it with Nebuchadnezzar, his father. And it reminds us, John the Baptist, how he spoke to the king. And it should encourage
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Same lesson we've been learning, that if you are committed to God, you're committed to faithfulness, when you're put in the position where you need to say something that could cost you your life, as long as you know what, I suppose it's kind of the idea of integrity. You know before something happens what you're going to do when it happens, so you don't have to think about it right then and there. Daniel was already prepared to give his answer, so to speak. We talk about that passage over in the New Testament. Be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you, a reason of the hope that is in you. It's sort of that principle that we're seeing here. Daniel knew he served Jehovah, and it didn't matter who he was going to talk to. He was going to stay faithful to Jehovah, regardless of that, to God. Even though there was a great reason to fear that the man might put your life out. He might snuff you out, so to speak, as he tried to in the previous chapter that I substituted for with the 3 other young men when it was Nebuchadnezzar. So absolutely, you want to talk about a character study, you'd have to include this if you were talking about Daniel, the character that he showed as a man of God. Yeah, it's a good comment. Anyone else have comments, questions, or something they want to point out about this chapter of Daniel? All right. Well, if that will be it, we will end, let's see, it's 9:42, 3 minutes early. I appreciate your time.